Hello, everyone. There's so many of you today, and thank you for joining. My name is Danica. I am with 3C Run in the County of San Luis Obispo, and welcome to our course, CALGreen Code with 2025 update. And we're here with Andy Pease and Tatiana Soglin from Inbounds Green Consulting. And before I pass things off to them, I just have a few logistical slides to go over. A few quick Zoom reminders before we get started. Please make sure you are on mute throughout the duration of the training. And we highly encourage questions. And if any questions do come up, feel free to put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. This session is being recorded, which will be shared with you along with the slides in the next few days. Next slide, please. And just a little bit about who we are. We are the Tri-County Regional Energy Network, also known as 3C REN. We are a collaborative partnership between San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties, and we are funded by ratepayer dollars collected through the public goods charge found on our utility bills. And the benefit of being ratepayer funded is that there is no cost to those we serve, and we are able to bring those dollars back into our region. And next slide, please. 3C Rent currently offers 6 programs focused around 3 services. We have incentives, training, and technical assistance. And our training today is part of our Energy Code Connect program. And you can find additional trainings and learn more about our other services by visiting our website, 3c-ren.org. And with that, I'll pass things along to Andy to get the course started.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Super excited to be able to talk about CALGreen and the compliance both in our current code cycle and then what's around the corner. And we'll be talking about mostly the mandatory measures, but still touch on some of the other options and with a focus on tools. This does qualify for AIA learning units, so and as well as ITC. So as long as you signed up, you'll get those automatically. So first, we're going to start with a poll just to see where everyone's at. So go ahead and just share. Are you new to CALGreen? Maybe have some familiarity, pretty comfy, know it well, just looking for that new stuff. Or like me and Tatiana, it just runs in your veins. It just live and breathe CALGreen. So yeah, okay. So we've got a little bit of a mix coming in here. We'll just give folks another half a minute here to share. So looks like a few folks that are new, most folks either pretty familiar, some familiarity, looking for the new stuff. We'll definitely highlight that as we go, and we'll keep going. Thanks for that. Okay. See if I can keep going. I feel like my slides just froze. Did I freeze? No?
No, you didn't freeze, Andy. Might just be your
Sorry,
presentation.
technical difficulty. There we go. Okay. Phew, that's scary. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with an overview of CALGreen. And then the intent of CALGreen as a program overall, just as, you know, some of this will be recap or how you talk to others about it. But it's a baseline green building code. So it raises the bar for the state across the board and then provides opportunities for jurisdictions or individuals to go into that voluntary or reach piece of it. We are going to focus on the mandatory throughout here, just make sure that we're all on the same page. And we'll talk a little bit about the tiers because they sometimes hint at what might come next. So in terms of the evolution of the code, 1975 was when we had the established the Energy Commission and the energy standards. So focused on energy. In the meantime, LEED, U.S. Green Building Council, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design came on, talked about all these other parts of green buildings that California identified as important for the statewide goals. And so they established CALGreen. And thankfully, it aligns a lot with LEED certification in terms of the categories, et cetera. And so now we move forward. It has a every 3-year code cycle with everything else. And so we're getting these better buildings because of it. So the highlights of the changes, we're going to be touching on both the 2022 intervening code cycle changes. We'll highlight those. They happened just a year ago, where we added a whole component of embodied carbon, more EV charging requirements, additional measures in voluntary tiers. So kind of keeping that thing current and rolling. And then the next code cycle that starts in January, even more EV charging. So we're going to talk a lot about cars. There's also bike parking for residential projects, and super, if you nerd out on this stuff, we have a new font. It's sans serif, right? So went away from the New York Times, Times New Roman, and now it's single columns, better numbering. It's just better. It's a better code. So I'm grateful for that. Okay, big picture, just as you're thinking about Title 24, sometimes we get limited, like Title 24 is just the energy code. We are, all of this is Title 24, and we are focused on Part 11, California Green Building Standards, we affectionately call CALGreen, not to be confused with the energy code, although of course there is going to be some overlap with the energy code and other ones. So somehow Title 24 got pegged to the energy code. All of this, Part 11. All right, and as you're reading the code, it's a little bit unusual because there's a residential and non-residential, and they have two different entities that are developing those. Thankfully, pretty well coordinated, but HCD is in charge of the residential side, Building Standards Commission is in charge of non-residential, and then DSA for schools, OSHPD for the medical, and they just have some of their own sections. So a little bit of a mix up. Make sure you check out the adopting agencies. CALGreen itself is organized administration. Definitions are good reference. They keep those really current. The scope is important as well. We'll touch on that. And then otherwise, the main content is that Chapter 4 for residential, Chapter 5 for non-residential. Some more resources, and then the tiers, those reach sections are in the appendices. So the scope, just so we're making sure we're not doing more or less than what is required in the residential, all new construction that's residential needs to comply with CALGreen. If you're doing alterations or an addition that add area or volume, that new part of the construction needs to also be CALGreen compliant. So if you're just messing around on the interior, it doesn't really matter. But if you're adding height or square footage, that does matter. And it, again, only applies to the new work that you're doing, unless there's something else in the code that triggers. If you do an upgrade of this and such size, you have to get your toilets in order or something like that. On the non-res, it's all new construction, additions over 1,000 square feet, or alterations that are 200,000 square feet or $200,000 in permit valuation. That number has not changed for years, so it gets easier and easier to trigger the non-res requirements. And then parking lot alterations and additions, which we'll touch on what that counts, but that also triggers CALGreen. And then mixed use, mixed occupancy. Each section needs to meet that requirement. It's a little bit tricky if you're doing maybe hotel motels are in the residential section. And so if you're doing that on a podium with retail down below, then that will need both a residential checklist and a non-residential checklist on your building plan. So you have to comply with both depending on that section. But if you're doing a multifamily housing and it just has a community room that's associated with a residence only, that does not trigger a non-res checklist. So you can just do that. For phase projects, just whatever is within that phase needs to be CALGreen compliant. So shell building, you don't have to do all the interior stuff, but once you do the TI, that's still new construction, right? That first build out of a TI is new construction, and otherwise it's an alteration or addition. And then just big picture showing CALGreen compliance, the best method is to have a checklist on the plans. In-house, we have developed an Excel spreadsheet where we kind of track all of these, and we'll put that on the plan sheet. But there's also this very simple form that the AIA puts out. I don't think they have the 2025 one up and running yet, but I imagine that they will. And so that has the all of the code sections, but really important, if you see this blank, it does not count. It doesn't help. What it has to have is this column with a yes or not applicable. And then if it is a yes, it should show the detail sheet where that thing is referenced. Otherwise, you're just listing the code, right? So just make sure that there's kind of upfront compliance. And again, you might have one for res and a whole nother sheet for non-res. Okay, we're going to go into mandatory measures. Any chat that or questions come in yet, Tatiana?
Yes, there was one question from Claudia saying to confirm when talking about what, oops, sorry, that scrolled. When talking about what someone needs to do, that applies only to jurisdictions that adopt that specific part of Part 11, correct?
Yeah, good question. So to clarify, all these mandatory measures are across the state. All the jurisdictions have to adopt mandatory measures. There are in the tier 1, tier 2, a jurisdiction can adopt either an entire kind of CALGreen reach code or certain elements. So if the CALGreen requires a certain amount of bike parking, a jurisdiction can say, we want even more. They can't say we want less, right? So great question. Thank you for that. All right, so now we're going to start going through the chapters, and it is organized again pretty well. I like this code. It's all the chapter 4 and then chapter 5 for the non-res. They're in parallel. So as we go through it, we're going to touch on each of these res and non-res combined because they do match up a lot. Anytime there's a code reference, we'll put that in the bottom corner there. And then we also throughout have some notes in orange boxes about documentation. So if you're a designer, this will help your plan review. If you're a plan reviewer, this can be something that you can know where to look for something or let folks know that this is where you would like to see it. Okay, planning and design. Very first thing it starts out with is reuse of existing building. This just came in the intervening code cycle as a conversation about embodied carbon, but we're going to put a pin in that and talk about all the embodied carbon options when we get to chapter 4 and materials and resources. Okay, so, and then some of these we're going to go through a little more quickly than others because they're either intuitive, have been part of the code for a long time. Again, you'll get the slides. So if it seems like I skip over some things, you'll have some resources and we'll linger after the class if there's something specific. Part of this is also just letting you know what's in the scope of CALGreen and kind of where to find it. So stormwater pollution prevention during construction, again, pretty standard practice that we're not trying to have erosion and dust. And so CALGreen spells out how to do that. And then for larger projects, you're going to get into the NPDES protocols for that. So documentation should be on the plan set. Along with best management practices and regulations as well, monitoring after the fact. Grading and paving, it should show that the grading and paving is sloped away from the building, right? We don't want a bunch of water running in. If you're not changing the paving, you don't have to make this happen, but of course it's good practice. And then always nice if you are having to drain from flat work to have it go into some bioswales to be able to manage the stormwater on site if that works out. And then bike parking. So under the current code, non-residential occupancy have requirements for both short-term bike parking, which is for visitors. I'm going in an office, I'm going to conduct some business, I bike in, I'm going to have some bike racks that are relatively close to the entrance and visible, right? So we don't want them tucked away. And it's based on how many, there's 2 minimum. And then if you have a larger parking lot, you kind of have to noodle through. If I've got 50 parking spaces, how many of those approximately are for visitors? And then 5% of those need to be short-term bike parking. Similar long-term bike parking. I work at an office. I need a place to put my nice bike while I'm there for, you know, an 8-hour shift. And so that's if you have 10 or more occupants. And then those folks are going to be kind of, again, as a percentage. All right. Coming up in the new code, a couple of changes here. So one is that was tricky to base the bike parking on the car parking. So now there's going to switch it to daily visitors. Much better, right? That's a way for if you don't have any parking, it would be helpful to be able to have bike parking. It will have its own issues as well. And then they're having a little bit more specificity for the type of building or tenant space. But for long-term parking, also new minimum of 1 long-term parking for each building type. Okay, and also in the new code, for the first time, we're going to have requirements for bike parking in residential and hotel motel occupancies. This has been a common reach code for jurisdictions. So now it's the visitor parking is 1 space for every 10,000 square feet. For long-term bike parking, so that's for residents or hotel overnight guests. Residents is 1 parking space for every 2 dwelling units for long-term bike parking, and then for a hotel motel based on square foot. And then public schools, as you can imagine, have more bike requirements. That makes a lot of sense. So your plan should be showing the bike rack type, the location, any details of it, and the calculations on the cover sheet, either based on the current car parking ratio or in the next cycle, the occupancy count. So what does that even look like for long-term bike parking? A cage within a parking area, a covered parking area with cages. This one looks like it's in a garage. You can do the bike lockers there on the bottom. The 2 on the right are probably not compliant, at least the way they are. The top one could be if it's like a tenant only locked parking garage. And it's a little hard to tell if how easily maneuverable it is to get those bikes up onto that rack. So maybe not our best choice, but could still work. And then the bottom one is just not anchored. It's just set on the ground, but maybe you could anchor it and then that one would be compliant.
Before we move on from bicycle parking, we had one question come in. How do you calculate the number of daily visitors?
Right, it's peak daily visitors. And again, this is it's a great question because we do this in LEED certification all the time because it's based on kind of that occupancy at the time, right? So if you change tenants, is that going to trigger in the future an increase in bike racks potentially? But it's your best estimate in talking with them. So if you are doing a restaurant, you can kind of count tables and say, okay, that's going to be so many visitors. Retail environment, you might be talking with the owner or their kind of guidelines that the mechanical engineer might use for occupancy. You wouldn't use the code occupancy minimum because that's what's legally allowed, but not a reasonable baseline for occupancy. So it's really, there's not an exact science on that one, but some guidelines are out there. Okay.
So follow up to that. So documentation would look similar to LEED for peak daily visitors. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to be thinking about that. Yeah.
Okay.
And
And
the
then
number of employees as well, right? So
mhm.
counting desks or stations in retail or something like that.
And
Great.
then one more, would part of the dwelling unit be considered for long-term bicycle storage within multifamily?
I'm not catching that. So say that again. So
Would part of the dwelling unit be considered for long-term bicycle storage within
oh, like
multifamily?
could you put your bike in your dwelling unit? Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. If you have a space, you can't, have a laundry room and then think people are going to just bike, stick it in the laundry room and then not be able to get there to the washer. But yeah, absolutely. You could put it inside in on that floor, as a shared closet or yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, but I wouldn't show it like tucked behind the couch as a bike parking space. So that's a little on edge, a little jurisdiction having authority, having to sort through. Great questions. Thanks. Okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time here on electric vehicle charging because it's had quite a few changes and honestly, it's the most confusing. So we're going to go through the definitions and then kind of the three use types of single family, multifamily, non-res, touch on heavy duty charging, heavy duty vehicles, and then additions and alterations. Okay, so the three types. EV capable is just an empty conduit, right? It's got space at the panel, but you don't have any wires and it's the kind of the lowest threshold. EV ready is when you have the wire and you have a receptacle, but you don't have the actual charging equipment. So it's ready for somebody to come in and plug in their charger, their cord, but it's not set up with a charger that people can grab and put into their car, right? And then the third one is the EV charging station. It's a level 2 charging station, and they can go in different. They'll meet different requirements. So physically, what that looks like, these level 1 is kind of low plug-in. If you've got a Prius, that's what it comes with. Level 2 are these ones, it's an actual charger. This is what is required. That level 2 with a 40 amp charging station is what is required for level 2. And then level 3 is a fast charger. That is not required, but it is allowed for code, and you'll see a little bit later that you can trade up. So, because you can get through a lot. So these type 2 there's level 2, there's a couple types. So there's the level 2, the 40 amp charge station. You swipe your card, whatever. There's a low power level 2. And so this is a 20 amp receptacle that is EV ready. So it is a little bit of a higher amperage than those little tiny trickle chargers of level 1. Level 2, where it's a charging station, it's obvious how to recoup your money. But just so you know that there's also now options for low power level 2, where you can charge folks for use of the outlet. Plugzio is one of the brands that's now brought this to market. So single family homes, if you have a 1-2 family, if you have basically your own private garage, you only need EV capable. They didn't want you putting a bunch of infrastructure into empty conduit for somebody who may or may not have an electric vehicle. So it's just having the space available, or you could put in a charger, but the minimum is the conduit and the panel space. The exception is not ADUs or junior accessory dwelling units. Either one, the state doesn't, the state says that doesn't trigger. If you are doing labeling, so if you have conduit only situation or marking something as EV capable, within the breaker, the panel, so just make sure that you're labeling that something is going to be able to accommodate the EV so it doesn't get lost. And then if you're installing it, then you should show electric vehicle charging only. But if it's just conduit or if it's just EV ready, it doesn't need to require that. Again, this is something I'm just, foreseeing in the future, that we're being tighter and tighter on parking requirements. And so if you put in a bunch of charging stations, but only allow people who are charging to use them, there's starting to be competition for parking spaces. So I think this is a conversation we'll be having in the future about how to balance, readiness in a small parking lot. Okay, so for multifamily and hotels, motels, in the current code, at the intervening code cycle, they totally bumped it up. And so, but still hotel motels were together. And that 40% current code have to be low power level 2 EV charging receptacles. So of all the parking spaces, 40%. And additional 10% should be the actual level 2 chargers, right? The 40 amp charging equipment. If you are doing a multifamily, the preference is for the electric vehicle charging equipment to be billed directly to the unit. So if you have an assigned parking space, unit 204 has an outlet or a charging equipment, and that is going directly to the occupants of 204's electric meter, so they are getting billed, unless it's infeasible. So I think that's tricky. It only works if you're assigning parking spaces, obviously. New for 2025, even more. So wisely, they have now split multifamily requirements versus hotel motels. And this is it's an equitable access issue. So now for multifamily, starting in January, one low power level 2 EV charging receptacle for every unit. Oh my gosh, every single one needs one. If it's open parking and you have 50 units, but you only have 40 parking spaces that people can hunt for, all of them have to have receptacles. Plus, if there's common areas, or in that case where it's unassigned, 20% of above that needs to have the chargers have actual EV charging. Hotels, motels is similar, except they've increased the level 2 EV charging percentage. And so non-residential, there's a current table, EV capable, and then of the EV capable, which of them, some of them have to become EV charging stations. So if you have the 26 to 50 and you need EV capable, 8 EV capable, 2 of those have to have charging stations. So then you end up with 6 EV capable, like just the conduit, and 2 that are actual charging stations. Next code, same thing, just more of it. So the bold is what has changed, and then a recognition that office and retail occupancies are going to need more than some other occupancies. I see chat coming in. I'm going to blaze through this, and then we'll see what we can touch on. Okay, so there's some alternative approaches to charging stations. So if you do a DC fast charger, you can do 1 Tesla equals, or equivalent fast charger will equal 5 level 2. So if you have a big parking situation, you can actually do some swapping out on that way. Conversely, if you want to do low power, like you only have that 20 amp capability, you can do twice as many and get the equivalency of the level 2. There's also a power allocation method. I haven't really worked with that yet, but I think it's a nice thing to be able to do a mix and match to accommodate. If you are using the fast chargers, at least one of those chargers, you can't swap out all of them for fast chargers. You need to have some regular level 2. And then access compliance, that's a whole different building code section, but there's a little bit of overlap here. So within the California Building Code, there's Chapter 11B. It talks about the requirements for charging electric vehicle. As soon as you put in an electric vehicle charging equipment, so not just the outlets, the actual equipment, it has to be van accessible, right? So minimum of one has to be van accessible. Then it goes to ratios. It does not count for the accessible parking for the, occupancy itself. So if you're already required to do 2 accessible spaces, then you do a charging station, then you also need that one to be accessible. So they can't overlap. Again, more conversations that we're going to have in the future. Interestingly, is that because the chapter 11 in the CBC doesn't include multifamily access compliance, CalGreen has it in there for now. So it's super, it looks just almost identical in terms of the aisle and the space and the access, but just basically everybody now, if you're putting in charging stations, they have to be accessible. And then trucks, if you're doing medium and heavy duty trucks have access, you don't have to install charging, but they want to make sure that our grocery stores, et cetera, have electric capacity to be able to add charging for electric hauling vehicles in the future. So it started out with just kind of grocery and warehouse, and then they've added office buildings, retail, all those folks are going to need that. Yeah, so that off-street can become viable. All right, and then public schools, community colleges, same approach, but just a different table. And then as it has come around is that if you are tearing up a parking lot to put in new lighting, then it is going to trigger the CalGreen sections for that. So depending on the current code, it's a percentage, the new code, everything that you're messing with to bring it up as close as you can with what you're messing with, as it were. So that is, and then just finally the documentation, lots of calculations, or at least the strategic calculations so that the plan reviewer knows exactly what it is you're working on. And then there should be alignment with your electrical plans and your site plans. And 2 different ways to communicate. One is to show if a spot is EV ready, and that's, you can just label it like that top one. But if you're trying to show the builder what to build, you can actually show what the striping is on the parking space. So that kind of 2 different documentation types, which may or may not be on the same building plan. Probably easier to put one on an architectural site plan and then the other in the civil. All right, Tatiana, I'm ready.
All right. Some of this you might have touched on, but we can kind of cover that. So first is, how is EV Ready expected to work in multifamily when there is no easy way to meter individual outlets on a large scale? Is it allowed for EV Ready outlets to be locked off during occupancy in anticipation of future installed EVCS when requested by tenant?
Wow, good question. I think, the solution that we have right now is the outlet kind of scenario that we talked about. I don't think that if until requested by the tenants to have it unlocked. I suppose again, if there is assigned parking spaces, either way you should be able to charge, either for an outlet or charging equipment. That's what all of us, if you're driving an electric vehicle, you got all the apps for ChargePoint or Electrify America or EVgo or whatever. We're used to having to pay for that. So if you can't charge it to the tenant, then you should be able to charge either the outlet or the charger. And the code doesn't say you can't do that. So that's what folks are doing.
Okay, and a follow-up to that one says, in addition to my above question, how is common area parking defined in multifamily? Is it just visitor office parking stalls, or is it any tenant parking that's in a shared garage or lot?
Yeah, good question. I'm not seeing a great definition on that, honestly. So I think it is basically any parking that is not assigned to a specific tenant. So whether or not if for a multi-purpose mixed use kind of building, does that include offices? I think the office, you would end up kind of having to do, again, some estimate of how much of the parking is that non-residential office application and how much is kind of for the tenants, even though it's a, we're doing the trade-off, right? Because then the tenants leave during the day and the office comes in. So maybe it would all count as under that residential in that scenario. Yeah, tricky one. Yep.
Mhm. This one you may have touched on, but for EV charging, is ADA, AMB, and van EV stalls part of the total EV requirements or a separate count in addition to the EVCS totals? And is AMB EV part of the EVCS total?
Those are good questions. I'll give a pass, and if not, if this doesn't, we have a code coach service, so which we'll highlight at the end. Those ones are super specific, probably best to use code coach. But in general, the parking total is includes those accessible spaces that are required, having nothing to do with EVs. And then the accessible EV charging does count as your EV chargers. It kind of goes the other way, right? So, all right, I think we better keep going, unless there's one last urgent one.
I think you're good to keep going.
Okay, if we have time at the end, we'll pick up some of those loose ends. Great question. And then just for folks who have been doing this for a while, we used to do kind of before we were adding all this infrastructure, there was this clean air, van pool, EV preferred parking thing. That thing is all gone. We don't do that anymore. It is in the tiers. It's a voluntary measure, but otherwise, in general, you won't see those kinds of designations. All right, just a few more in the site category is our biggest one, the planning side. So that has the most, just light pollution, right? This has been around for a while. You can do backlight, uplight glare, or local ordinance, but there's energy code exceptions. They used to conflict. A couple code cycles ago, they got in alignment. So if you have something with small lumens, so it's just not that bright in the first place, you don't have to do the documentation for the bug rating, but do provide a lighting schedule on the site. If you are doing bug ratings, you got to show the property line and the distance to the property line, and just make sure you're showing all of that. And then if you're doing schools, shade trees are required. Very cool. All right, energy efficiency. There, like we said, it does overlap with the energy code. Must comply with Title 24, Part 6. That's it. That's all you got, really. And then we go underwater. All right, with that, I'll catch a breath, and Tatiana.
Thanks, Sandy. So the requirements for fixtures and fittings are pretty straightforward. You're probably familiar with this already. This chart shows the allowed flush or flow rates in gallons per minute, gallons per flush, or gallons per cycle. An important thing to pay attention to here are things like water sense labels for toilets and shower heads. And another thing we want to make note of is the residential bathrooms that have a maximum of 1.2 gallons per minute, but they're also the only fixture with a minimum rate of 0.8. So sometimes in mixed-use buildings, there will be a blanket 0.5 GPM faucet put in for all the lavatory faucets, but that doesn't meet the minimum for residential. So we want to make sure we're hitting that threshold in those spaces. There are CALGreen mandatory measures related to water submeters. We put together this decision tree to help you determine whether submeters are required depending on your project and water usage. For non-residential projects, a new construction project, or an addition over 50,000 square feet, needs a submeter if you have a use over 100 gallons per day. If it is less than 50,000 square feet, it doesn't need a submeter unless you have a use that is considered excessive. And CalGreen categorizes excessive consumption as a use over 1,000 gallons per day. So that could be something like a building with multiple tenants, and there's a use like a restaurant or a laundromat. In those cases, you would need a submeter. For multifamily, all units must be submetered per the plumbing code. And this also includes ADUs. So as a reminder, projects are considered multifamily if there are 2 or more units. So each unit needs separate submeters, and this helps with accountability for water use and for billing. Food waste disposers also have a maximum threshold. They must be less than 1 gallon per minute when not in use, or an automatic shutoff after 10 minutes of inactivity. And they must be less than 8 gallons per minute when in use. And all of this will need to be included in the fixture schedule. For landscaping and outdoor water use, you'll use the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, MWELO for short. This is a tool for looking at outdoor water usage for landscapes over 500 square feet. You'll need a table similar to this one. It doesn't need to be color-coded. We just like using this as an example. In the bottom left, there's a calculation for the maximum applied water allowance, giving the amount of gallons of water you're allowed to use annually, and that's based on the project's location, evapotranspiration rate, and the landscape area. And then you'll compare that to the proposed usage, which is based on the plant type and irrigation efficiency. And this will be somewhere on the landscape plans. A lot of times we see it either with the irrigation plan or the planting plan.
We also see more enforcement that the landscape plans need to be included with the permit. Because that was a lot of times folks would be like, oh, we're not doing landscaping now. And then they would do landscaping later, but not run it through the permit process. So they wouldn't do these calculations. So it is important to have landscape, full landscape design and drawings as part of the permit.
For special uses, MWELO is required for public schools and community colleges where there are 500 square feet of newly constructed landscape projects or 1,200 square feet of rehabilitated landscape projects, and healthcare facilities must comply as well.
All right.
And I think I'm passing it back to Andy.
All right.
Yep.
So some other requirements as we get into the materials section. A lot of this is about the durability of the project, and because as things decay, then there's also mold, and that impacts health. And so there is rodent proofing. CalGreen says, look, don't just use foam to seal up an opening. It needs to be something cementitious or metal. And then make sure that you have a weather resistant foundation, so you're not setting any wood or something in that could come in contact with the dirt. Don't let the sprinklers get on your building, so because that's a convenient way to get a lot of water into a wall assembly. And then exterior openings in non-residential settings should be have both flashing of the drainage plane, but also that the primary doors need to have non-absorbent materials right at the entry, and it has to have an awning or an overhang or recess so that the door has at least 4 feet of protection from rain. So that's but staff entrances, even though it's like, well, that's not the primary. Well, it's a primary for a lot of people, so it's going to get open and closed. If it's emergency exit only, then no, that wouldn't require it. Construction waste reduction is currently at 65%. It had been 50%. It's held at 65%. This is challenge in terms of recycling markets, etc. It does require a waste management plan, And then there's an optional pathway to reduce the generation of waste in the first place. So you don't have to worry about waste diversion if you just don't make much waste in the first place. This is pretty challenging unless you're doing like modular construction or panel construction or something like that. Then you really would have a lot less waste generated. If you're doing an addition or alteration, you must address, they call it universal waste, household hazardous waste, all those things like lamps and ballasts and thermostats, they need to be disposed of properly. And of course, laying, clearing debris, plants, all of those things must be 100% recycled. And now embodied carbon. Woohoo! Back to Tatiana.
Okay. Effective July 1st of last year, it is now required as part of CALGreen code to address embodied carbon on non-residential projects 100,000 square feet or more, or schools under jurisdiction of DSA 50,000 square feet or more. This will reduce on January 1st of 2026 to 50,000 square feet for all non-residential projects under the 2025 code cycle. There are 3 pathways to compliance, and we will briefly walk you through each of these. They are building reuse, life cycle analysis, and the prescriptive pathway. To understand each option, we need to know what embodied carbon is, where embodied carbon shows up in the construction process, and the scope for looking at each of those pathways. So embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions arising from the manufacturing, transportation, installation, maintenance, and disposal of building materials. We don't want to get this confused with operational carbon, which is related to the greenhouse gas emissions due to building energy consumption. Operational carbon is the type of carbon emissions you're probably more used to hearing about. And you may have seen a chart like this showing where you'll find carbon in the construction process, and the terms at the bottom can help us determine the scope of which stages we want to look at. So the cradle to gate scope focuses on the product stage. This is your raw materials extraction, transportation, manufacturing, the things that go into making the product. And this is the scope you're looking at for the prescriptive pathway. Next is cradle to grave. This includes that product stage, but also construction, use, and end of life stages. This is the scope of the whole building life cycle assessment. And last is cradle to cradle, which includes the whole cradle to grave scope, and additionally, beyond the building life cycle, things like recycling or reuse, which is where the existing building reuse pathway comes into play. Looking at a little bit more of a detailed overview, we have our building reuse option for additions, where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. The mandatory measure requires 45% of the structure and enclosure to be reused. Next is the whole building life cycle analysis. This is the modeling pathway where you'll need to show a 10% reduction in embodied carbon from a baseline building. And last is the prescriptive path, which targets carbon reductions in specific materials. For the mandatory measure, this limits the global warming potential to 175% of the industry-wide average from environmental product declarations, or EPDs. So we'll run through a quick example. This is an example of documenting the reuse of an existing building pathway. Again, this method's for additions or alterations where the addition is less than 2 times the area of the existing building. So for the example here, we have a 45,000 square foot existing building and an 80,000 square foot addition. This method targets primary structural elements and building enclosure materials, as seen on the bottom left. And this is excluding hazardous materials as well as windows and insulation. And that's to encourage replacing windows and insulation with higher performing materials. For the calculation and documentation, you'll make a quick spreadsheet like this, listing your areas for the primary structure and enclosure elements, and then list the areas for materials that will be retained. add those values up and drop them in the worksheet 3 below, which is provided by CALGreen. And then you'll take your percentage of retained area for both the primary structure and existing enclosure and do your total percentage. For this example, we're retaining 54.57%, which is meeting the 45% threshold. Next slide, there we go. For the second method, we have the whole building life cycle assessment. For this one, you'll need to build a model similar to an energy model, but instead of measuring energy usage, it measures embodied carbon. And this one looks at that cradle to grave scope over a reference study period of 60 years. You're looking at the same materials as the building reuse method, except this time including glazing and insulation. We get a lot of questions about how to generate the baseline to compare your design building to, and that reference building or the baseline building should have the same location, orientation, size, function, and space conditioning as the proposed. And that way you're ensuring you're just comparing the materials. And your materials baseline should be based off of what a typical building design for a project of that type in that location would be. We've listed some tools below. Athena and One-Click LCA are free tools, and there are paid software options as well. Sphera, SEMA Pro, and Tally. Tally has a Revit plugin, so if you have a good Revit model already built, it can be imported into that program so that another model doesn't have to be built from scratch. This is an example of what a project looks like in Athena. It's a typical trunk and branch structure. Again, if you're familiar with energy models, it looks a lot like that. You'll go through and describe building assemblies through dialog boxes that request simple information like base sizes and loads, and the software will do the rest for you. It calculates a bill of materials and the associated environmental impacts for you. And users have the flexibility to add materials as needed or import your own bill of materials from any CAD program. We have another presentation that's much more in-depth, digging into the weeds on how to use Athena, and that can be found on the 3CREN website as part 4 of our previous ZNCD series, and the Athena portion starts at about minute 30, and I have the link. I will drop that into the chat so that can be referenced. Okay. And the last of the 3 pathways for embodied carbon CALGreen compliance is the prescriptive path. This method has a much more limited scope, targeting some higher impact materials determined by the Buy Clean California program. These are things like certain types of steel, glass, and insulation, and of course, concrete. This table here shows the maximum acceptable global warming potential, or GWP, which is based off of industry-wide averages. For the products on the top half of the chart, you just need to find products with a GWP below what is allowed. For concrete on the bottom half, compliance is determined by a weighted calculation. Each type of concrete has a different allowed GWP value and will have a different actual GWP. So to determine compliance, you'll follow the equation, multiply each actual GWP with the volume used, add those together to get the total carbon impact, and then you'll do the same for GWP allowed, and you'll just want to make sure the actual GWP is lower than the allowed. And product data for each material will be found on environmental product declarations, or EPDs, an example of which can be seen here, and the GWP value is right there in the first row. So most of us are probably not working on 100,000 square foot buildings where the embodied carbon requirement is triggered by code. But as we mentioned earlier, the square footage threshold will be reducing to 50,000 square feet in 2026. And over time, we can expect it to become more relevant to a wider variety of projects. So we want to start thinking more about strategies and addressing embodied carbon now, so you can start implementing some of this, and then when it is required for your projects that you're working on, you'll already be more familiar with it. So this slide, it has a lot of information. I'm not going to go into depth on each one, but here we're calling out some of the high impact material categories for cost-effective low carbon product selection. Generally speaking, concrete and steel tend to be the places many projects find to be great areas for potential embodied carbon reduction at no to low cost premium. For example, this can be through using alternative cementitious materials for concrete or steel with high recycled content. And there are also opportunities in insulation, glazing, and finish materials. So taking a little bit of a closer look at insulation, this slide here shows the embodied carbon of different insulation materials, some as net carbon emitting and others as net carbon sequestering. Not all insulation works for all conditions, but where a substitution is feasible, charts like this can act as a guide to select alternative products. We can see that the emissions vary greatly. Foam materials tend to be pretty common and are among the highest in carbon emissions. Mineral wool is even still net emitting, though lower than foam, and fiberglass bats are a bit lower. Switching to non-petroleum products such as cellulose, hempcrete, and straw bale, you're moving more towards sequestering carbon instead of emitting. And we have some other examples to the right of expanded cork, wood fiberboard, and there's even emerging technologies like mycelium board, which is made out of mushrooms. So we see insulation has a lot of options for material replacements, and there are always new things coming along. So that's an interesting one to kind of keep tabs on, what's emerging. And again, we have a lot more information on embodied carbon in particular, really going much more into depth on each of these embodied carbon strategies and more on sequestration. That presentation is also available for free on demand on the 3C Run website. And I will also drop the link to that one in the chat. There we go. Okay. I think with that, I'm passing it back to Andy.
All right, fabulous, thank you. And then finishing up the materials section, there is an operation and maintenance manual requirement. So this can be a little binder, it can be a cloud-based something, but the CALGreen has very specific requirements for what needs to go into a homeowner's manual. I mean, if you think about it, a toothbrush has more instructions than a house a lot of the time when you buy it. So all the warranties, appliances, maintenance schedule, the value of downspouts, all those things. And then they added last cycle defensible space. Also, how to recycle, how to get incentives, energy efficiency. In the non-residential world, commissioning is required by CALGreen. And that is a process that can help produce these O&M manuals for non-residential. So that should be documented on the plans that this is a requirement, because it often gets forgotten at the end, and then inspectors can ask to see evidence of it. There needs to be space to do the recycling in the first place, and just as California increases the requirements for recycling, diverting organic waste, just make sure that you're designing spaces that can accommodate landfill, recycling, and organics for landscaping and food waste. So commissioning is one of those that overlaps with the California Green Building Code and the Energy Code with some differences. The basic premise of commissioning is that it's a little bit like a punch list at the end, but it starts at the very top because you're checking things against what the owner wanted in the first place. So there's owner states their owner project requirements in terms of temperatures and controls and light levels, how they want the thing to work. The design team has a basis of design that shows what their design was to meet those project requirements. Then the plans need to reflect what the design team said that they were planning on. And then there's a commissioning plan that says, hey, here is our process for checking to see at the end, we're going to be looking for these different things, what meetings we're going to have, who's on the team. Then there's the actual performance testing, right? So it could be the test and balance, that's by a third party, but then the commissioning authority might needs to go in and review those results and do their own check. And just again, full circle, making sure, does this meet the controls, temperature, light levels that the owner wanted in the first place? Within the building permit process, these first requirements, the first 4 are all part of the permit plan for new construction, new residential building or non-residential building over 10,000 square feet, unless it's a storage building. But otherwise, pretty much any conditioned space is going to need the OPR, BOD, commissioning plan, and the requirements in the documents. The rest of it happens during construction, but again, can be requested by the inspector at the end to get the testing, the documentation. Training is required, and then the commissioning report. The Energy Code has a nifty form for this, form fillable that you can fill out. Note that there are some specific differences. Commissioning for Title 24, Part 6, the Energy Code requires some parts commissioning light for projects that are under 10,000 square feet. There still needs to be a design review. So this form is required for non-residential projects under the Energy Code. Also, CALGreen adds irrigation and PV as part of commissioning, which Energy Code does not. For projects under 10,000 square feet, there's still a formal testing and adjusting process so that your engineer should be developing a process and describing a process for testing the system and making sure that the thing is going to work, but it doesn't have that whole OPR commission plan type of thing. And there is a reporting requirement for that as well. Tatiana, any pressing questions we need to catch up on before I jump in? Okay. Whew. Okay, last of the major categories here. Again, you can't have open combustion. It's California, come on. Temporary ventilation, current code is MERV 8 for temporary, and then you go to MERV 13 for permanent. But new next cycle is that the temporary air filters must be MERV 13 as well. And these are fat, so make sure you take those into account. And then in terms of indoor air quality, we're getting better about this. Thankfully, we're seeing that folks are covering the tight ends of a duct with either taped on plastic or cardboard, but taped on, so that these other things down here at the bottom, either having it open or you're just kind of shoving things in there, or it's kind of crushed. Any of those things are not going to work. Ideally, the ducts come in with their ends covered, then they're installed, open while they're working on it, then they cover it again. And then if they get ripped open, you cover it again, right? So, because otherwise what happens, like if you then, they're sanding the drywall and that little bit of dust gets in, and then the dust settles in, gets dampness, and then that's how you get mold growth. So if by chance duct is left open and gets dusty, then there's cleaning protocols. So it's not like you have to tear it out, but you do have to clean it because we don't want that mold growth in our ducts. Pollutant control, thankfully, again, this has been on the books quite a while in terms of adhesives, sealants, carpets, resilient flooring, paints and coating, composite wood, so MDF, plywood, OSB, oriented strand board. So all of those things have had requirements for a long time. So most of the stuff that's on the market is going to be compliant with these VOC limits, and the VOC limits have not changed for a decade or more as well. The thing that you have to be careful on is sometimes outdoor rated products get moved inside. So inside products are usually pretty good, but like one time we had somebody tack down carpet with this really industrial material that was intended for outdoor applications, and they just used it to tack down carpet. So that was over. So those are the things to look out for. This current code cycle, they've added insulation, ceiling tiles, and wall panels all need to be in that low emitting categories. And so the you can actually look at the specific VOC, but there's also this certificate of compliance method, which is kind of a convenient way for especially products other than paints, well, even paints, but if you can get a compliance document to know that it meets this Green Guard or some of these other standards, that is helpful. Okay, no smoking. So no smoking within 25 feet of building entries, outdoor air intakes, operable windows for buildings, and then of course inside buildings. So if you have a no smoking campus, like nobody's allowed to smoke on site, that's fine. Or you can also do a designated smoking area that is 25 feet away from the building. But if you are just kind of leaving it to chance, you really should have signage, because otherwise people just step outside and start to smoke, or they go around the corner and they're smoking or vaping, either one, and then there's an operable window or an air intake. So just have your signage line up with the actual conditions. So it's shocking to us how often the signage falls short in terms of what's allowed or not. So 25 feet. And then a few other construction ones, capillary breaks for your concrete, vapor barriers, making sure that they're the one on the left doesn't have either vapor barrier or capillary break. So to be able to have the vapor retarder that's all taped off and sealed. So that, again, so we're not getting moisture that weeps up through the slab and then rots under the flooring. That is nasty. Moisture content of buildings, that there's little moisture meters. You can plug them in and make sure that either just from environmental or just too young, that hasn't been properly dried. You don't want to close up a wall that's wet. And so inspectors or whoever's doing your field verification can make sure that that's not wet. And then of course, protect the materials when they're delivered on site, right? You don't want them actively getting wet, getting a little bit wet, but just close them up altogether, or better yet, keep them indoors until they're needed. CALGreen does talk about the exhaust fan. There's also lots of energy requirements about fans and indoor air quality in the energy code, but in terms of bathroom fans, for residential, it needs to be ducted to the exterior, needs to be Energy Star compliant. You can do a whole house ventilation system that's ducted, but you still need to be able to have anything with a shower or tub. So if it's just a half bath, you don't have to do this, about the humidistat, right? So it's triggered by relative humidity. You can't just open a window. I mean, you can just open a window, but you can't meet the code by just opening a window. All right, and then in terms of design, again, this is in the residential world. If you're not doing a full ASHRAE model, then you do need to use this ACA manual J, D, and S. And so you need the documentation, you need drawings, you need calculations. And so we're starting to see, thankfully, jurisdictions asking for a real plan, because otherwise the HVAC installer just kind of going, typically we use this size of equipment. It's usually oversized now. And so that's a waste of energy and the owner's funds as well. So indoor air quality, meeting the energy code and code of the regular California code, carbon dioxide measuring, Currently, it's required to have CO2 monitoring in classrooms, and now in 2025, any classroom. So if it's a university, a private school, everybody picked up on DSA's. Good idea to have CO2 monitoring. And then acoustic control, wasn't part of green building 20 years ago. And then folks realized how impactful it is for quality of life, human comfort, and human health in that world. So there are requirements. You need to have a sound transmission class. That's how we designate acoustic isolation. In this case, we're trying to show have a level 40 or better. And so you can do this, like if you do double wall cavity, can achieve it. You can use special insulation. So there's different ways to achieve that kind of STC, and it needs to be between tenant spaces and between tenant spaces and the public. This bottom right diagram is showing a shell, and then there's a TI. And if that first TI needs to make sure that they are doing the STC, so when the second TI comes in, that there's the appropriate sound isolation. Exterior noise will get triggered if you are someplace noisy, so near an airport or freeway or train, and you can look and get the noise contour legend from the local authorities in that area. So again, STC 50 for walls and roof, and then windows have a rating as well. Ozone depletion, GHG reductions, we've been on that track a long time, thankfully. And then code cycle before last added supermarket refrigeration leak reduction. So we're trying to make sure that we're not leaking refrigerant in these high impact areas. So we're going to feed more attention to the leak reduction in refrigerant as that scales to different systems. Okay, and then we are in the other stuff category of CALGreen. Those were the mandatory measures. And so just kind of some quick hits on what the rest of the code has. So 6, 7, and 8, chapter 6 has current links to all the references. Yay, they keep that current, so that's pretty helpful. 7 has a special inspections. There's some code cleanup in the next cycle, which we appreciate. And then chapter 8 has a whole bunch of handy dandy forms for calculating a water budget. So if you don't want to comply prescriptively with those water thresholds, you can demonstrate that you go higher in one area and lower in another, and it all comes out to that water budget. Construction waste management has a template. That life cycle analysis has a template. Commissioning, lots of templates and more. So kind of a useful section there. And then the tiers. So as we mentioned, within each category, there's a whole section of voluntary electives. And if you want to do, you might like a jurisdiction might say, tier 1 isn't required, but if you get tier 1, you can do either additional floor area or expedited plan check or something like that at tier 1, tier 2. So if you do all of tier 1 or all of tier 2, you have to hit some new prerequisites within each section, and then you choose some elective. Again, similar to LEED in that way. So in the residential section, these are the requirements. Non-residential, similar. There's mandatory measures and then electives within each category. SLO County requires tier 1 for projects that are over 10,000 square feet. But then they waive the tier 1, tier 2 requirement for improved energy performance because they didn't want to go after the REACH code with the CEC. So, and then here's just an example of a tier 1 elective that's bird-friendly building design. So in this case, we're seeing birds that fly into buildings, but there's some really reasonable strategies to be able to help birds recognize that that is not a tree, so they won't fly into it. And so they have some options. You pick 1 or 2 of these to be able to apply to your building, and then you meet that tier. The other thing about the tiers and why we wanted to highlight one or two, this was added recently, and it makes us think like, oh, I wonder if that's going to fold in to become a mandatory measure at some point. So the tiers are definitely a hint to what's around the bend, the mandatory. And with that, we will wrap up and be able to answer your questions. We do want to note again that we have a code coach. It's totally free. We'll talk about any of the energy code or any of the CALGreen. You just go online, you fill out your question. You can call, and then it's also available in Spanish. So if you have contractors, if you yourself would be more comfortable in Spanish, we have a code coach who can respond in writing or by text. Yeah, so do use that. Put in a couple other CALGreen resources. One is that AIA checklist that you can just go ahead and access. The California Energy, kind of the same folks that do Energy Code ACE, have a codes and standards page that has a whole bunch of other resources, including the link to the code itself. And all the local reach codes are in there. So that's pretty handy to especially if you're working in a new jurisdiction, to know what's there. Danica will be your point of reference if you have any questions about your AIA, your learning units. She'll send you the recording. We have a survey that's available now. We'd love for you to fill it out because we really need to be able to improve and meet whatever requests that you have. We do have upcoming courses for anyone who's interested to be able to come online. Hot water, performance modeling, that's a kind of a peek behind the curtain about how we do that Title 24 energy modeling, hot water, and then next generation passive solar, and that will meet zero net carbon design unit requirements if anyone is looking for that. And with that, I thank you for your time. I'm going to stop sharing and we can go ahead and see if folks have questions. And Danica, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on?
No, that's it. And if anyone's interested in our 5-part energy code series with 2025 updates, those are also on our 3C Run on Demand page.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a whole series. I forgot to mention that. This is the only one on CALGreen, but Jennifer Rennick goes, and with Grant Murphy, goes through all the section on residential, non-residential, ADUs, alterations, additions, etc. So those are all available online. Tatiana, I know you've been kind of checking in on the chat. So anything else, or if somebody wants to raise their hand, just let us know either a question or an insight. We always love hearing stories from the field or folks who have been doing this a long time. If we missed a hot tip, we'd love to hear from you on that as well.
We do have some questions in the chat if we want to kind of start with those.
Sure.
Is it on the contractor to know the requirements of the CALGreen codes related to the construction process, or does that need to be part of the permit set, for example, covering the mechanical equipment?
Yeah, great question. We are fans of having all of that in the permit set. So the contractor is responsible for knowing that code. But the nice thing about that AIA sheet, or if you have a different process, is that the language is right there. So it says all ducts covering, all ducts shall be covered. So it at least hits on it. It doesn't have necessarily all the detail, but then the contractor would have some insight that that there's a requirement there, so they can go and look it up and make sure. So it is on the checklist. It should be in the notes on the permit plans. And then the contractor is held to that either way, but fan fan of having it on the, well, it's required to have it on the plan.
Okay, and another one says, in regards to adopting the CALGreen cycle, can the local AHJ delay adopting the cycle and default to their prior cycle until further notice?
No, I'm gonna say no. I'm guessing that, that's actually not my area of expertise in terms of what's required, but my understanding is that the local jurisdiction needs to adopt the baseline, and they can adopt their amendments that go with it. It just can't be less than what's required. I'm just trying to think, like City of San Luis Obispo, where I live, there's or a lot of times we'll see like changes because of soil conditions, but it always goes higher, not lower. So I don't think you can just skip a cycle unless that's part of the new AB 306. They've just decided that we're not going to do a new update to the energy code for that 2028. There won't be any updates there, but CalGreen is still going to proceed on its cycle, I believe. If that didn't help, you can write to the code coach and we'll check it out.
Let's see. Joe asked, does adopting a CALGreen tier count as a reach code?
So a whole tier would count as a reach code because the tier 1 has you have to be better than Title 24 Part 6 by X%, and tier 2 has it even more. So yes, that would count as a reach code unless you do the county of SLO, which would be where they exempted the energy portion. But and usually there's already you have to have a cost effectiveness study, and I don't know what the status is for the different climate zones right now. But if you don't have it in place because of that new state legislation, you wouldn't be able to adopt a residential reach code for energy right now anyway, unless you already have one on the books or could get it in place by the end of September. Sorry, that was not too messy.
There's a lot of questions on EVs.
Okay. And then I'm just gonna I see one here about, is affordable housing still exempt to the multifamily water sub-meter requirement? Only if the building owner is paying for all the water. So if the tenant is buying their own water, being billed for their own water, then they need to have their own water meter. So we're seeing everybody being billed for water. Okay, so EV questions?
Yes. Can you repeat how accessible parking counts towards the EVCS totals?
Okay, so if you have 100 parking spaces and you're required, not thinking about the EV requirement, but you're required to do accessible parking, and let's say you have to have 5 spaces. One of them is van accessible, and then the standard. I'm making this up. I haven't, looked at that side of it. So those 5 are triggered, and so now you have 98 spaces total, including your ADA spaces, right? And so that's the number that is going to get tied into the percentage. Again, this is the current code that is based on the number of parking spaces. Okay, so if you're thinking more about the upcoming code where it's based on peak occupant, and then you have the ADA spaces, those do not count. Even if you put an EV charger at the accessible space, it does not count as one of your EV charging spaces, right? So I think that's the main takeaway on that, is that whatever is required by the building code, chapter 11, needs to not factor into, your EV parking. They can share a drive aisle if you only have a couple and you just want to share that 8-foot access aisle. They can share that, but those parking spaces do not count for the EV van accessible. So then you have an EV charger. As soon as you have an EV charging equipment, not the outlet, the charging equipment, at least one has to be van accessible. So if you only have one, sorry, it has to be van accessible. That maybe made it worse. Again, if you have questions, send it to the code coach.
Could you speak in more detail to the voluntary tier 1 and tier 2 measures for EV on top of the changes to mandatory requirements?
Yeah, I didn't study those super closely. I don't know if you did, Tatiana, but my recollection is it just is higher. It's just more of them. So if 5% was required, the tier 1 would be 10% and tier 2 would be 15%, kind of like that. So just more actual charging equipment instead of just the EV ready, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. You mentioned that EV-ready outlets are expected to be able to be used by tenants, but how are you metering regular outlets in unassigned parking spaces? I'm used to seeing them blocked or switched off in anticipation of later installing a full charging station that can handle the metering.
Yeah, so, and I think that's an interesting evolution here, is that EV ready was just kind of like a box where you could add equipment later. And now they're like, well, if everything's all wired there, put an outlet on it. So I suppose maybe it's a both and. Maybe you would have your ready ones. But now it's very specific that the EV ready has to have an outlet, has to have a receptacle, right? So whereas before, I think that it was, conduit was EV capable, conduit with wires was the EV ready, and it would just go to a box. But now once you go to EV ready, that they want a receptacle at it. So then you end up having to have some system to charge. Or a tenant could have a key, I suppose. I didn't think about that. If you wanted to have controlled access, but it's not just locked until a new equipment is installed. We're coming up on 11 o'clock here, so we're going to stay on just a few more minutes, but I do appreciate everyone who joined in and meeting your requirements. So we'll stay here, but if you got to go and get on with your life, we totally understand. Thank you for coming. Any last questions? Right, so that same, yeah, I think you just, the billable, how to bill for an outlet, I think is just using some devices that are now on the market, so. Okay.
Oh, we got a question regarding ICC units. Mario, I'll make sure that you receive your ICC units. We got your 8-digit ICC number, so that should be enough information for us to report your CEUs. Thank you.
All right, and we'll go ahead and call.
Oh, sorry. I think we did got one last question.
Yes, looks like in multifamily residential, was the EV charging station requirement removed in favor of the low power receptacle at 1 stall per unit, or will a certain percentage of EV charging stations still be required?
Yeah, so if you have assigned, this is a little bit of a trade, right? So if you have assigned parking, only, then no, charging stations would not be required. Only the EV ready with the outlets. Because how else would you can't, unit 31 has a charging equipment, but unit 28 doesn't. So no, so unless there's common spaces where you could then put in actual chargers, that's how that's going. I think it's probably a reasonable trade-off, because especially, 20 amp, I think there is parity with what happens in a single family home, right? Is most people, if you can charge overnight, and you can get a pretty good charge with an outlet and a 20 amp panel spot. So
And with
probably a
that,
reasonable trade.
yeah, I think we're at the end of our session here. So thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Andy and Tatiana. We'll see you guys again.
All right. Thanks, everyone. See you.
Bye.
Bye.